So Mario is gracious enough to return to our circle once again to share his ideas around clear thinking and the Enneagram. Mario is an executive coach, leadership development consultant, author, and Enneagram teacher. He zooms in from us outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he lives with his wife and his four sons. Do jot down Mario's website, mariosikora.com, to learn more about him and the services he offers. I have known Mario for a long time. I consider him a friend. I enjoy learning from him. I have deep respect for him. I think you will find him a powerful and charismatic speaker. Mario, thank you so much for being here and let me know how I can support you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nancy. I appreciate those nice words, and thank you all for being here. Um, I know that's a group from a variety of places. For me, I'm on the East Coast, so it's a little bit later than it is for many of you. To be completely honest with you, this is usually my bedtime. So, but I'm happy to be here anyway. I was telling Nancy and some of the others before the session that I took a nap this afternoon, so I would be nice and fresh. Thanks for having me again, Nancy. Um, so let's see. So I've been working with the Enneagram for a long time, about 30 years now, and primarily I work in organizations. As Nancy said, I'm an executive coach and consultant. And for those of you who might work in organizations, you understand that it's sort of a different environment than a lot of the places where the Enneagram is worked with. There's more of an expectation of rigor, I think, and there's more skepticism, I think, as well. So when you work in organizations, you have to be prepared to defend your point of view on things, right? And this fits with my mindset, as you can see in my name space here. I am an Enneagram Type 8, and I have all the baggage that comes along with that, such as being combative and a bit of a know-it-all, and very certain in everything that comes out of my mouth, whether it's objectively true or not. So I need these skills that I'm going to be talking about as much as anybody, right? So what we're going to be talking about tonight fundamentally is epistemology, right? Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that has to do with the nature of truth, right? How do we know what we know? Actually, I'll say it's the nature of knowledge rather than the nature of truth, okay? Because my perspective is, and shared with a lot of other people in the field of philosophy, that we really can't know the truth, right? All we can do is get closer to it, and we can have higher degrees of probability. What we can do is falsify things, right? We can say that this is not true, and that helps get us closer to the truth. But the truth is never really something we can acquire, okay, in an objective sense, okay. I'll touch on that as we go, but it's always intriguing to me that the Enneagram grew out of a group of people who refer to themselves as seekers after truth, okay, which I think is a wonderful thing. I think seeking after truth is really important, and it's something we should all be doing. The problem with being a seeker after truth is that we often prematurely believe that we found it, okay? And that can get us into trouble. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is how, in general, we can protect ourselves from over certainty, how we can protect ourselves from being deluded by mistruth, and specifically how we can apply that to our work with the Enneagram, okay? So this is a presentation that my teaching partner, Maria Jose Monita, and I did in San Francisco at the IEA conference. And Beth tracked me down and asked us to do it for this group too. So thank you, Beth, for advocating for this session here. All right. So with that, I'm going to get right into it. And so here's how this is going to work. Okay, so I'm going to go through some slides. I'm going to talk a bit. One of my early slides is it's actually a group of questions that I'll ask you just to consider in the back of your mind throughout my talk tonight. And then we're going to do some breakout rooms at the end. I'm hoping that I manage my time effectively and we have time for you guys to discuss those questions in groups and then come back. Okay, so we're going to do that. So we will have some time for question and answers, but if you have questions, or in particular, if anything that I say is unclear or doesn't make any sense, because again, it's past my bedtime, so I might be rambling at some points without realizing it, please feel free to let me know in the chat or by raising your hand, okay? So with that, I'm going to see if I can share my screen without a problem here. There we go. Just bear with me. There we go. Everybody see my screen? Are we okay here? All right, good. All right, so yeah, well, see, as you say, this still says IEA 2023 conference with me and Maria Jose. Maria Jose will not be joining us this evening. Maria Jose does not trust me with the slides, so she always makes these in an unalterable form. So I can't go in and edit these things because she knows I'll mess them up, and so that's why it says what it does. So here are the questions I mentioned that, I'm just going to read here. And again, you can let these float in the back of your mind. Is there anything that you teach that makes you a little uncomfortable? Okay. I remember having, years and years ago, my co-author and I, Bob Talon, wrote a book, Awareness to Action. And I remember having a conversation at the time with Bob saying, we have to make sure that we have the courage that if we realize that any of this stuff we're teaching is actually bullshit, we need to acknowledge it and admit it, right? And for our own integrity and for the sake of our clients. And that is something that has stuck with me ever since, and I try to adhere to. So I always ask people, is there anything you're teaching that doesn't quite feel, particularly right to you? What would you do if I stopped believing something that I teach? And then what are my responsibilities to the truth and to my client's understanding of the truth, for those of you who work with people? As someone who works with people and, who gets paid by people to give them advice, I take a really strong sense of responsibility to making sure that what I'm telling people, I feel relatively confident in. And I think it's something that we all need to do. All right. So again, we'll come back to those questions towards the end, but I wanted to plant the seeds of them in your mind. Why clear thinking? Why do we care about clear thinking? Why does it matter? The Enneagram is often thought of as a system of three centers, right? You've got the body center, you've got the heart center, you've got the head center, which represents, being embodied and taking action, which represents feelings and emotion, and which represents discernment, the ability to think. And it's my experience in the Enneagram world that this how to think well often gets left to the side, right? A lot of people really love the body stuff, really love the heart stuff, and those are all wonderful. But I think sometimes the capacity for clear critical thinking gets put by the wayside to the detriment of people who work with the Enneagram. So it's my self-appointed task to emphasize the head discernment in our work with the Enneagram. Okay. So let's see here. I referenced Seekers After Truth earlier, okay? And again, that's really just another way of talking about epistemology. And again, epistemology is the branch of philosophy that has to do with the nature of knowledge. How do we know things? And, what's ironic, I always get teased for using the word epistemology, right? So, people tease me for using, 10-cent words and that sort of thing. The reality is that we're all trying to understand what is true in our worlds. Okay. We live in a time I have four boys, okay? So they do not know a world without cell phones. They do not know a world without the internet. My oldest is 20 years old. They do not understand what it was like to live in a time when we did not carry all the information in the world in our pockets, okay, which we do now. And I always like to tell people we've got all the information in the world in our pockets, and 90% of it is nonsense. 90% of it is wrong, 90% of it is distorted, 90% of it is inaccurate, and so forth. So we live in a world where it's even more important than ever to be good at understanding the nature of what is, how we know what we can, how we can know what we know, and how we can identify nonsense when we're faced with it. So we're all trying to do this. You can do it well or you can do it poorly. I always tell people you're an epistemologist, whether you like it or not. You can either be a good one or a bad one. It's up to you. Okay? And so what we're going to talk about are some of the skills necessary to be a good epistemologist, and again, how that influences our work with the Enneagram. Now, epistemology has to do with understanding the nature of claims. And it's always important when we get into this discussion that we understand the kind of claims we're talking about, particularly when it comes to the Enneagram, right? So, people make claims about the Enneagram all the time. And I've seen people get into debates about ideas having to do with the Enneagram and so forth. Um, Before we can even have those conversations, we have to always understand what kind of claim are we making here, right? Are we making a fact claim or are we making a subjective claim? Okay, a fact claim is, something objectively true, factual. Okay, the Earth is a sphere. Gravity makes, bodies of less mass move towards bodies of more mass or greater mass. These are objective fact claims. Okay, they're either true or not. They can be identified. But then there are subjective claims. I prefer Coke to Pepsi, actually Coke Zero to regular Coke. That's a subjective claim. That's not true in the same sense that the Earth is a sphere. It's not true in the same sense of what the speed of light is. It's just a claim that is true for me, whether it's true for you or not. I was doing a session like this earlier today with a different group, and somebody asked me who is in the photos behind me here. Okay, that's Miles Davis and John Coltrane there. And apparently the guy who asked the question was a big John Coltrane fan like I am and started holding up all of his John Coltrane CDs in the background while we were doing this. And one of which he held up was Coltrane's A Love Supreme, which I am firmly convinced is objectively, truthfully, factually the greatest recording ever made. Okay. But I'm wrong about that because that's not an objective statement. Okay. That's a subjective statement. It's my opinion. So we have to understand the difference in these two things. There are historical claims about the Enneagram that can be kind of fact checked, right? That can be evaluated, that can be considered through a critical lens, which I think needs to happen more because I see some fantastical historical claims about the Enneagram that I don't quite buy. Then there are metaphysical claims, okay, things beyond the nature of what we can truly know. This gets into the issues of faith and belief and, what lies beyond. Again, metaphysical claims are not held to the same standard as fact claims. And then finally, we have causative claims. These are always interesting to me. I became an Enneagram type 8 because this happened or that happened, or because my mother didn't love me enough, or my mother loved me too much, or, I've got some object relations pattern, or whatever it is. I am always very, very, very cautious about any kind of causative claim about Enneagram type. I think humans are really, really complicated. Honestly, I don't think we have any clue what makes any of us a particular Enneagram type or not. Okay. But again, that's just my opinion. Right? So ways of knowing we talked about already. Okay. This idea of epistemology, distinguishing a justified belief from opinion. Two basic domains, okay, objective knowledge and subjective experience, which I've already touched on. This is a hugely, hugely important distinction, right? It might sound like it doesn't matter, but one of the things that I get all the time from people in the Enneagram world is, well, there are different ways of knowing things. And, science isn't always the best way to know something, or not everything is about facts, and et cetera, et cetera. And I agree with that, but we use different tools for evaluating different ways of knowing. Okay. And this is where it's important. There was a great essay by the Dalai Lama in the New York Times, I think it was in about 2010, called Our Faith in Science, where he talks about this very topic. And he says, people ask me, he was a big fan of, sorry, he is a big fan of science. And he says, people ask me all the time, what would I do if I found that science contradicted some tenet of Buddhism? And he said, well, what I would do is change my Buddhist belief, because science is one thing, Buddhism is another. Now, there's not a whole lot of science-based or fact-based claims in Buddhism, but he was making the point that we have to use the right tool for the right knowing task. Okay. Really, really important stuff. All right. I believe this is, again, really, really important, that if you teach people anything, particularly the Enneagram, you have an ethical responsibility to do your best to teach things that are true and not be reckless in the claims you make. Okay. I see a lot of reckless claims out there in the Enneagram world, and it always really, really frustrates me because, again, the work that I do, and I'm sure the work that many of you do, affects people's lives. Okay. When I'm working with a client, that is somebody who's not only leaning for me for professional advice on how they can do better in their role, but they're usually people who lead others, who have the fate of other people's jobs in their hands. And if I am reckless about any claim I am making, either about the Enneagram or anything else, I am being unethical, plain and simple. Okay, um, so this for me is a topic related to ethics and not just being a smarty pants. All right. In my perspective, there are basically 5 obstacles to clear thinking. Okay, so I created this clear thinking model a while ago. And when I'm working with people, I do a program called Clear Thinking and Decision Making for Leaders. And I frame the obstacles to clear thinking in these 5 basic categories. Okay, at the root is all the built-in biases that shape the way we think, that distort the way we think. Excuse me. One of the things that every wisdom tradition tells us, every science of the mind tells us, is that we are easily fooled. We believe things that are not true about ourselves and about the world. Our perceptions are distorted. As the Apostle Paul wrote, we see as through a glass darkly. Okay. Every wisdom tradition tells us, okay, our minds fool us and we need tools. From an evolutionary biology or a cognitive science perspective, we know that there are lots of biases in the brain. There are things like motivated reasoning. There are things like tribalism that shape how we think. There are cognitive dissonance, which causes disruption in the brain, which we make go away through a series of cognitive biases that distort how we perceive the world. We have to be aware of these things so we can protect ourselves against them. What the Enneagram tells us is that personality can be a distortion of the world, of how we perceive the world. I see the world through an 8-ish lens. Okay. I see a world that's red of tooth and claw. Okay. My wife is a 7. She sees the world through a very different lens than I do. Okay, she perceives things very differently than I do. I think she's naive. She thinks I'm a lunatic. All right. Um, you know, so uh, we're going on 23 years. She hasn't changed her view on that. So personality, and this is what the Enneagram tells us. It reminds us to step back and to see the distortions in the way that our personality can distort the way we perceive things. Culture is another layer of distortion, and culture works at many levels. There's organizational cultures, there's family cultures, there's regional cultures. Okay, I'm in the mid-Atlantic part of the US. I'm from Philadelphia. We're very different here than my friends down south in the Carolinas, who are, very polite and very nice. We're much faster and more intense than my friends on the West Coast and my friends in Colorado. You go to different countries and people have different cultures. Okay, cultures shape the way we see the world. I remember going and teaching in Korea once, some years ago. And in Korea, the students just sit and stare at you the whole time. They don't answer questions. They don't ask questions. They don't participate in exercises. I thought they hated me. Okay, for 2 days, they just sat and stared at me, expressionless. And I thought, this is the worst workshop I've ever had. But at the end of it, they just all came up and hugged me and had their pictures taken with me and all these things. And I just wasn't reading the culture. I didn't understand that that's just what they do there. Okay. So culture is another factor. Next is ignorance. Okay. The things we don't know distort the way we see the world. And so we have to always be working to fill the gaps in our ignorance. And finally, misinformation. And this is a big one today, and it's getting worse, and it's going to get even worse still. With artificial intelligence and, fake videos and all of these things, we are really going to be bombarded even more in the future with misinformation, and we need to know how to spot it, how to identify it, how to debunk it, and how to overcome it. And I see a lot of this stuff in the Enneagram world too. Okay, so there's a lot of misinformation out there about the Enneagram, even if it's just dumb fact claims, dumb descriptions of the Enneagram types. I saw something this morning. I got a Google alert about the Enneagram, and it was this woman who I'm sure is a very nice woman. She was on a local news show in Pittsburgh talking about the ideal Valentine's dates of each of the 9 types. And if you're dating a type 1, you should do this and create this kind of, Valentine's Day. Now, I have to admit, I couldn't watch past type 2 because it was such garbage, but it was just stereotyped, not somebody who clearly had no idea what she was actually talking about. Okay. There's a lot of this stuff out there. All right. So there are tools that we can use through to protect ourselves against these things, to protect ourselves against the built-in biases. There are antidotes and guardrails, I call them. There are tools we can use, concepts we can use to protect ourselves. By the way, I'll say this now so I don't forget. This comes from a little book that I wrote called How to Think Well and Why, the Awareness to Action Guide to Clear Thinking. If you would like a free PDF copy of that book, you can send me an email, mario@awareness-to-action.com, and I would be happy to send you a PDF of that, okay, or where you can download it. It's also available as a real book on Amazon, but like I said, I'm happy to give you a free copy. So when it comes to working with personality, I have a model called the awareness to action process that helps us overcome the traps of personality. I do culture mapping exercises, educating ourselves, and then finally developing logic, reason, and debunking skills. Okay, so I know I'm just throwing information at you here, but I want you to be aware that there are these tools that you can access. All right. Let's see here. Foundations of clear thinking. Here are some ideas that I hope you will take away with you tonight, if nothing else, the value of these 3 things. Okay. Number 1, skepticism. Okay. I don't, as I mentioned, I have 4 boys. I don't teach them the Enneagram. I don't talk to them about the Enneagram. They couldn't care less. My oldest son is in college now. He's a junior. He's got a girlfriend, and his last year, his girlfriend was starting to tell him about the Enneagram, that her and her family were reading an Enneagram book. And he said, I think my father does something about that. And so they Googled me. And yeah, we're quite surprised to find out that I'm a minor, Enneagram guru here. So that just gives you, just for perspective. But I will tell you, I pound on my boys' heads about being skeptical, about falsification, about epistemology, because I think these are foundational skills. Skepticism is simply the ability to be open to anything, but also expect the evidence to support the claim. Okay. Um, Here's an example I like to use. Okay. So I can tell you, you know what? I have all of Bruce Springsteen's CDs or albums or, whatever they are. And I probably do. Okay. I think I do. But, that's not a big claim, right? I mean, that's not something that you're going to argue with me about. You'll probably just say, oh, that's nice, Mario. Who cares? And of course, my sons would say, who is Bruce Springsteen? But, but again, it's not an extraordinary claim. So it doesn't require extraordinary evidence. Now, I can also tell you that I actually ran into Bruce Springsteen on Madison Avenue one time, right outside of the Ralph Lauren store at 72nd and Madison Avenue. We passed right past each other, my wife and I. We said, "Hey, look, it's Bruce Springsteen," and he said, "Hey, how you doing?" And walked across the street and got into the back of a car, and but he was there shopping by himself at the Ralph Lauren store. Now, you might believe me or not. Okay, you might say, "Well, yeah, that could happen." I can imagine Bruce Springsteen at the Ralph Lauren store. But you might want to prod on the details a little bit. You might want to ask me, "Oh, yeah, how tall is Bruce Springsteen about?" or something. Just to confirm that I'm not just BSing you. Okay. Now, if I come to you and say, "Hey, you know what? I'm really Bruce Springsteen." Okay. This requires a bit more evidence. Okay, this is a bit more of an extraordinary claim. So we have to evaluate the nature of claims, the magnitude or the importance of a claim. And skepticism says you need evidence to support the claim. We also want to think in terms of probability. This is important for a number of reasons. Okay, so one of the more important reasons for this, for people who work with the Enneagram, especially if you work with clients, is when it comes to assessing people's Enneagram types. Okay, there's this tendency to want to rush in and evaluate somebody's Enneagram type if they're a client and say, spend 10 minutes talking to them, ask them 6 questions and say, okay, you're a type 7. And people can, once they do this, they can become very wedded to their point of view, or people can become very wedded to identification with their own Enneagram type, whether they're typed correctly or not. Recently, somebody online offered a hypothesis that I'm not actually a type 8, and suggested that I was in fact a type 6. And my initial reaction was to just reject it out of hand. But then I thought, well, let me think about it for a moment. And so I thought about it for a moment and, came to the conclusion that I think he's wrong. And I asked the people who know me well that, do you think I may have mistyped myself and so forth? I was at least open to the idea for 10 minutes. Okay. Which I think we need to do. Whenever I am assessing a client's Enneagram type, I always tell them, here is my provisional hypothesis. Okay. Based on our conversation so far, here's what I see. But if new data comes in, I will change my mind, because that's how good thinkers think, right? They always look for new evidence. So always think in terms of probability. How confident am I in something? Don't fall into black and white thinking. Now, finally, this comment here of explanation and falsification. I think I have a slide that talks about this a little bit more, so I want to go to that. So, okay, we talked about skepticism already. We talked about thinking probabilistically. I'm a big fan of the philosopher Karl Popper, right? Karl Popper was a philosopher of science and of politics. I think he died in the 50s or 60s. But he was he's been hugely influential in the way I think about things. But, he had this idea of falsification when it comes to science, that the way we know whether or not something is science is whether it can be falsified and, so forth. But he said, here's how knowledge is created. Okay. Knowledge is created by, first of all, we experience some sort of problem. Hey, wow, this is weird. I wonder what's going on, right? Or I wonder what happened here. Let me think about it. Okay, so step 2 is conjecture, right? Let me think about it. Let me come up with some sort of explanation, some sort of hypothesis on why this might have happened or what happened here. Once we come up with a hypothesis, we practice error elimination, meaning we try to prove ourselves untrue, or I'm sorry, we tried to prove ourselves false. Okay. We try to pick holes in our own theory. We hold it up to other people to try and pick holes in it, to try to eliminate errors in it. Again, we can say somebody's Enneagram type. Well, I think maybe he's a 5. Let me see if I can find evidence that he's not a 5. Okay, so I can try and falsify my own hypothesis. It's just one way that that can come into place. Through this, we refine our explanations of things, and then we repeat. And again, this is where, Popper would have said we can never truly know the ultimate truth because we're always learning things. We are always trying to, gaining more knowledge. And any body of knowledge that is static, that is fixed, that never changes, as far as I'm concerned, is not very useful. Okay, that's just dogma. I feel the same way about the Enneagram, quite frankly. Okay, I think, whenever I hear people talk about some sort of pure Enneagram and some official Enneagram, it makes me nervous because while I think that any innovations with the Enneagram need to be rigorous and need to be thought through and need to be practical and, all these things need to be vetted, I think that if we don't continue to think about the Enneagram and reevaluate and improve our understanding of it, then we're just going to fall into something that becomes outdated. Okay. So the process of falsification of our own ideas is really, really important. Right. So it's hard to do. Trust me, especially if you've written a book and then a few years later, you say, you know what? I don't agree with what's in that book that I wrote anymore. I have people coming to me all the time saying, hey, well, you wrote this. And I say, yeah, I wrote it in 2004. It's 20 years ago. I would hope that I think a little bit differently now. Okay. But it's hard to admit that at times. I have to say. All right. I have down here both rationalism and empiricism are incomplete. I'll just say what I mean here. So rationalism is trying to reason our way to the truth. Empiricism is taking in information through the senses. Popper was saying, you know what? Neither of those are complete in themselves. We have to do both of them in our conjecturing and error elimination. Bear with me. My ham-handed fingers closed my screen. Here we go. All right, good. So we'll move on. So why is it difficult to do this? Well, there's a few reasons. Okay, number one, cognitive biases. And we're going to talk about a few cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are distortions of the brain that cause us to delete, distort, include information that alters our perspective on things. Logical fallacies. I think are important to understand. We fall into logical fallacies all the time. And then I include this one here because it's really relevant to the Enneagram. Patternicity. I'm not sure who coined that term, but it's a tendency to see patterns where they don't actually exist. Okay. And our brains do that all the time. Okay. If I was to draw 2 dots and a crescent underneath them, your brain would see a face. Okay. Because that's what brains do. When we look at the moon, we see, quote unquote, the man on the moon, right? Because it looks like a face. We do this all the time, and people love to see patterns in the Enneagram. Okay. And I've seen some crazy pants extrapolations from the Enneagram. The same person who told me that I was a type 6 instead of a type 8 said that he has a model that identifies 186,000 variations of Enneagram type. Okay. That's some beautiful mind patternicity sort of stuff going on there, right? And, the Enneagram invites us to do that, but our brains are doing it all the time. So we have to be careful about seeing patterns where they don't exist. Okay? Cognitive biases, I'm going to talk about a few here quickly and how they influence our work with the Enneagram. Okay, so confirmation bias, the tendency to see evidence that supports our point of view and not see evidence that doesn't. I was introduced to the Enneagram in 1994. A couple of years later, I was doing the Enneagram training with Don Riso and Russ Hudson. And I think it was the part 3 training at the time where they talked about the subtypes. And so I'm there doing the training, and I knew Don and Russ a little bit. We had some mutual friends, and so at one point, Don walks over to me and says, "Hey, Mario, did you figure out your subtype yet?" And I said, "Yeah, Don, I'm a self-pres 8." And he looks at me and he says, "No, you're not. You're social." And then he walks away. All right. Now, we're not supposed to do this as Enneagram teachers, right? We're not supposed to tell people what their type is, but he was Don Riso. So, you give him a bit of slack. So, and the more important thing is that he was correct. Okay. And what happened for me at that moment, I realized that there were 2 or 3 things about the self-preservation 8 that resonated with me, and I got fixated on them, and I started seeing evidence that wasn't actually there. And I did not see the evidence that pointed to me being the social subtype. Okay. But once I saw it, I started seeing all the evidence, and I realized that, well, Don was right. He knew me well enough to know, where I fit, even if I had not seen it yet. So we can all fall into confirmation bias very, very easily. We see a couple of pieces of evidence and we fixate on them, and we miss the bigger picture. Fundamental attribution error. Okay, this is the tendency to generalize about somebody from one piece of data. If somebody if somebody yells at me, in public, I immediately go to, well, they're a jerk, right? They're just a person of low character. When in reality, they might have just had a bad day, or I might have deserved to be yelled at and didn't realize it, or something, but there might have been extenuating circumstances. Okay. Now, of course, if I yell at somebody when they don't deserve it, I don't say, well, you know what? I'm just a bad person. I say, well, I had a bad day, right? Or this happened or that happened. So this is what fundamental attribution error is. We tend to see ourselves in context, whereas we see other people, one data point equals their character. And again, we can do this with the Enneagram. Oh, look, she laughed. She must be a 7. Okay. Or, oh, look, she passed me the salt. She must be a 2. Or, look, he's reading. He must be a 5. We hear things like this all the time. Okay. They extrapolate from one data point to something. Something called the anchoring bias. When the way we usually think about this, when people are negotiating, when one person sets a price, the negotiation becomes within a range of that initial price rather than something dramatically different. Okay. So if I, for example, get into my mind that, oh, somebody must be a body type, okay, because of the way they hold themselves or something, I can just limit myself to thinking about them being an 8, 9, or 1 and not think of the other types, even if they might be there. So we have to be careful about getting anchored close to a data point. And then finally, availability heuristic. I did a workshop one time. It was in Spain. I was doing an Enneagram training there. And there was a woman who knew one type 8. She was very new to the Enneagram, but she knew one woman, a friend of hers, who was a type 8. So she would continually say, well, 8s have a tendency to do this, because it was something that her friend did. Whether it had anything to do with that woman being a type 8 or not was besides the point. In her mind, she had an available image of what a type 8 looked like, and that became her reference point. Okay, we do this all the time. I had another guy approach me at an Enneagram conference talking to me about my book after it was first published, 20 years ago this year. And he says to me, he tells me that he read my book, and then he says, he hands me 3 pieces of paper, typewritten pages, and he says, I'd love you to read this article that I wrote. Now, I know that 8s don't read, but it's short, so I'm hoping you'll read it. And I'm thinking, okay, I wrote a book, but you're assuming I don't read. And he was assuming this because his wife was an 8 and she did not read. All right. So again, we get this idea in our mind and we don't look at the bigger picture. Okay, it helps to be conscious of these. Now, there's again in my book, there's a lot of these a lot of these cognitive biases listed. You can also find a lot of this stuff on the internet. I really encourage you to research these things. All right. Let's see here. Why are they so common? I'm just going to do this quickly. You all might have heard, if you're here in the United States, that there's an election coming up. Okay. I don't know if you've, caught the news on that, but, apparently there is an election coming up. And one of the fascinating things to me is how people can disagree with me on who should hold elected office in this country. Okay. It just boggles my mind that anyone would think differently than I do. But believe it or not, at least half the country does. And so there are times when I marvel at this. But I realize that we're just doing what humans do. Okay, we fall into biases for a very specific chain of events. Number one, we want to belong. We are tribal creatures. I need to know that I'm part of a tribe and I am therefore protected and I am therefore secure. So I start to identify with people who are part of my tribe. We need stories. There's a great quote from Joan Didion, the author, who's wrote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." One of my favorite all-time quotes. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. This is how the human mind works. We create stories about things. And once we have those stories, we don't want to change them. So we hold on to them. And in order to hold on to them, we start falling into motivated reasoning. We reason our way to what we already believe instead of what is actually true. We do this all the time. Discordant beliefs are a threat. Okay, evidence that I don't like, ideas that I don't like. They cause us to experience cognitive dissonance, stress in my brain that I don't want to have to deal with. So what do I do to get rid of it? That's where cognitive biases come into play. Okay, confirmation bias, etc. It makes uncomfortable ideas go away so I can be comfortable with my stories, so I can feel comfortable as part of my tribe. All right. This is what we're up against, folks. Okay. This is what you are doing all the time. Okay. So don't just think this happens to other people. We all do it. All right. I know I'm throwing lots of information at you. Again, we'll have a chance to talk and ask questions. So feel free to, hold on to them. All right, some logical fallacies I always like to talk about, particularly when it comes to the Enneagram. Okay, number one is argument from authority. Claudio Naranjo said it, so it must be true. Okay, my good friend and Nancy's good friend Russ Hudson said it. It must be true. Okay, Mario said it. It must be true. Actually, I don't hear that one quite as much, but it could happen at times. We have a tendency to believe something just because somebody of authority said it. Now, this doesn't mean that it's false just because some authority said it, but if the only evidence of something is that it came from an authority, that's not enough. Okay, that's what's called an informal logical fallacy. Doesn't negate it, but it also is not sufficient evidence. Okay. In addition to that I'm sorry, bear with me here a second. I got to get my screen. Argument from antiquity. It's old, so it must be true. Okay. I got news for you. There's a lot of stuff that's old that ain't true. Okay. There's a lot of practices. I whenever I hear about, ancient medicine practices or something, I always say, well, it didn't work out so well for George Washington. I don't know if you all know how George Washington died, but he died because the treatment of the day was bleeding people when they had diseases. Okay, so, Washington was sick and his doctors said, well, let's take some blood out of him. And he didn't get any better. So they said, well, we should take some more blood out of him. And he still didn't get better. So they said, you know what, let's try this again. And they took more blood out of him. Okay, well, what they didn't understand, but we know now, is you need that stuff. Okay, so you need that blood inside of you in order to function. All right. Again, it's an old medicine that is not necessarily true. Lots of things that, and we love old stuff. We love to say, oh man, this is, millions of years old, right? Um, yeah, okay, that's nice, but it doesn't mean it's true. Conflating correlation with causation. This is one of my favorites. I love to work ad hoc ergo propter hoc into a conversation anytime I can. It really irritates people, but it makes me feel smart, right? If we got any West Wing fans out there, was actually an episode called Ad hoc ergo propter hoc, where they talked about this logical fallacy. After a thing, therefore, because of a thing, right? So, this caused that, not necessarily. Okay. The cock crowing does not cause the sun to rise just because it happens beforehand. Okay. And again, we need to keep this, in mind when we're working with the Enneagram. The no true Scotsman fallacy. I had somebody say to me one time, or I read this, that they wrote that in order for somebody to be truly a type 8, they had to have a large chin and a strong jawline. Okay. And they said invariably, eights have big chins and strong jawlines. Now, I've worn facial hair for going on 40 years now. And the reason is because I don't have a big chin. Okay. I like to, wear some facial hair to cover up the fact that I don't have a whole lot of chin going on. Okay. So I went to this person and said, and here's what the beauty of it was. They said, if somebody claims to be an 8, but they don't have a big chin, they're actually either a 6 or a 9. Okay. So I suggested that maybe they reconsider this because it was an example of the no true Scotsman fallacy. Okay. No true Scotsman fallacy. And this is a technical fallacy. I don't know if this is politically correct anymore to use, nationalities for this, but what are you going to do? It's in the books. So the idea is, somebody claims that all Scotsmen love whiskey. And somebody says, well, McGregor is a Scotsman, but he doesn't love whiskey. And the response, well, was done. He's no true Scotsman. Okay. Meaning that, you don't meet my criteria for something. So we have to be careful about that, assuming that all 9s do this or all 8s do this, or they're not a real 9. We see a lot of that around 4s these days. There's this desire for only a select few people, it seems, to actually be 4s. So, there are people out there on the internet telling everybody else they're not a 4 because they're not a real 4 because they don't do this or that. And then finally, there's the anecdote fallacy, okay, where we make decisions by anecdotes. Okay, look, this person doesn't read, and that person doesn't read, and they're both 8s, so therefore 8s don't read. Is a challenge we can fall into. Okay, again, knowing these things makes us better at working with the Enneagram because we spot nonsense more quickly and we know why nonsense is nonsense. Right? We can see these fallacies and biases at play. Right? And if you work with clients like I do as a coach or a therapist or something like that, it helps you see through the twisted reasoning and justifications of your clients. Okay, so it can make you better in that as well. All right. All right, let's see. I think we've got some argument from authority. Okay, I'm kind of repeating here. If Einstein said it, it must be true. If it's old, it must be true. Great, I'm repeating myself. Appeal to popularity. I didn't talk about this too much. Well, everybody believes this, so it must be true. We hear that about the Enneagram all the time. Because an idea is popular, it must be true. The reification fallacy. Okay. This is a big one, treating a concept or metaphor as if it was the real thing. We see this in the Enneagram all the time. There are people who used to believe that because I feel things in my chest, that the heart was the source of insight and wisdom and knowledge and so forth. Not quite the way it works. Okay, it's more complicated than that. So we have to be careful about taking any metaphor too literally. Okay, this applies in lots of ways. All right, let's see here. What else do I have? Oh, yes. False authority. I am amazed at how many times people ask me for my opinion about something that I have absolutely no right providing an opinion on. Okay. Well, what do you think of the Israel-Palestine thing? You're an Enneagram teacher. What do you think about what's happening there? What are you crazy? How do I know, right? The best minds in the world have been trying to figure that out. I got nothing to say on that. I'm just a guy at the bar when it comes to talking about things like this. Okay. We have to be real careful about expecting too much from our gurus. Let's see here. What do we got? Logical fallacies are common because reason is not the only way we respond to information. We respond to information emotionally, right? And so, because we respond to information emotionally, things feel right. Well, it feels right to know that somebody important said this, okay, even if it really doesn't mean anything. And so we often overlooked flawed logic. I read this fascinating study some years ago where they found that in the face of charismatic people, there's a part of our brain that actually starts to shut down, right? It's part of the prefrontal cortex that goes to sleep, right? Our critical reasoning starts to shut down. And they suspected that there was some evolutionary adaptation in this, that by relying on the alpha character, it increased our chances of being safe and so forth. But there's part of our brain that shuts down when somebody important tells us something. We have to guard against that. Okay, we have to be aware of our tendency to fall into that trap. All right, a few tools. Okay, we talked about falsification already. I always tell my clients, ask, how do I know this to be true? And what is the evidence that it is not true? Okay. We have to be careful about leaps of inference. Okay. That's saying, well, there are 9 of this and there are 9 of that. Therefore, the Enneagram dates back 2 billion years or something, right? Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Okay. We need more evidence, right? I always tell people, well, you know what? There are 9 players on a baseball field. Doesn't mean that Abner Doubleday knew the Enneagram. Okay, so we have to be careful about the claims that we make and the leaps of inference we make. And then finally, Occam's razor. This is my all-time, probably one of my all-time favorite ideas. Okay, Occam was the medieval monk who said, do not add variables. Now, if you hear about Occam's razor, it's usually defined as the simplest explanation is always the best explanation. That's not really what Occam was saying, and it wasn't true. What he was saying is if you can explain something in 2 steps, don't add a third. Okay. And in the Enneagram world, we love to add variables, right? We love to add things. Again, I mentioned I recently interacted with a guy who had 186,000 variations on Enneatype. Takes a much bigger brain than mine, right? I just stick with 2 variables. Talk to me about the instinctual biases. Talk to me about the 9 strategies. Anything beyond that, my head can't calculate that big. Okay, so keep it simple. And if you know the ideas, the basics really well, then you don't need to add variables quite as quickly. I'm not saying that some of those variables are not useful. I know there's a lot of people who like to add other things to it, and that's fine. I always look for what's simplest. Okay. All right. Again, the magic question, how do I know this is true? How do I really know this is true? And what is my evidence against it? Ask that question of yourselves all the time. Why this matters. Whoops, I'm sorry. Let me go back here, and then we're going to get to, I think we have time for a quick breakout, right, after this. Okay. So this matters because ideas have consequences. Okay. If you put ideas out into the world, you are responsible for what you put into the world. If you spout nonsense about the Enneagram, like this poor woman on this news show today, you are responsible for making people dumber. All right. Don't be that person who makes people dumber. Okay. Be the person who makes people smarter. Be rigorous in your ideas. And there are issues of credibility. Again, it's, when I first, and some of you who've been working with the Enneagram for a long time, in 1994, nobody knew about the Enneagram, right? If I talked about the Enneagram to somebody, it was new to them, right? No worries about them having heard it here or there or anywhere else. Now, when I talk to people about the Enneagram, a lot of people are familiar with it. And a lot of people say, isn't that astrology kind of stuff? Or isn't that the thing that they do with like paints at Sherwin-Williams? Or isn't that the thing they talk about, what kind of dog you should get, or these sort of things? Um, because that's what people are doing with the Enneagram these days, right? They're making it stupid and they're making people stupider. It undermines the credibility of anybody who's actually trying to be serious and do good work here. Okay. So again, you have a responsibility as a citizen and as somebody working with the Enneagram to take this seriously. Okay. Boy, I really turned into a scold tonight. This was not my intention. I apologize. Like I said, it's late and I'm a little, I guess, a little cranky for me, but
That caffeine was kicking in, I
it
think.
could be. Yeah. And I only had a
And the
couple of sips.
olives, the caffeine in the olives.
All right. So why don't we do a little breakout exercise, okay? And I'm going to ask people to let's see here. What do I have here? Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Instead of those questions that I asked earlier, I am going to ask you to talk. Nancy, I'm going to ask you to put folks in groups of 3 or 4, okay, whatever makes sense for you. And it's a very simple question, okay? How am I going to think differently about my work with the Enneagram after this? Is there any idea that I can start applying? All right. So I'm just going to ask you to think about how you might apply some of the things I talked about tonight. Okay. And then we'll ask you to report back. So how about we put them in a group for about 10 minutes, Nancy, and then we'll bring them back?
Got it. Got it. And Kate, Kate is not feeling well, so don't worry about it, Kate. You're in a room by yourself. Everyone else has at least 3 or 4 people set for 10 minutes. We'll see you then. Bye. See you back in 10. One group has 2. I lied. They're going to have a really good conversation.
Good.
You back up? Go ahead, Mario.
Okay, so I would love to hear just some feedback, some sharing, if anybody has it, or if there are any questions of what we talked about. So, who would like to share what they shared in their group with the rest of us? You can raise your hand if you want, or I think for time, I'd rather have you say it than write it down, but it's up to you. If you want to write it in the chat, go ahead. Anybody have any comments they'd like to share?
I can call on each one of you. We have time.
Then I'm jumping in, Nancy.
They're laughing,
I am
but
not going to have you call on me.
go, Ernie.
That is not going to happen tonight.
No,
I
You know
would
I
say,
do that.
I
we
would say,
know, we know.
for me, the most profound thing, yes, I've been greatly exposed to the Enneagram. I certainly do not teach it. I certainly do not claim to know it that well. But what I do with the Enneagram, and I was talking to Elliot and Helen about this, I use it strictly internally for myself, for how I may see myself, and then I will run with it. And, and that's mine. But also in interacting with other people, I was telling Elliot that, you have 9 character types from which to pick when you're talking to people. I spent many, many years doing contract negotiations, which, if you can pigeonhole, which is probably a bad word, but I will pigeonhole people, around the conference table into certain personalities. I will not project that on them, but I will use that internally to know how to get what I want. So the Enneagram has helped me there, but I certainly do not instruct people or project to people, what I think they may be.
Yeah.
So in terms of, how will I think differently about the Enneagram? I'll just keep it kind of to myself.
Great, great. And first of all, it's a good thing. I don't think it's a good idea to go around telling people what their Enneagram types are, or making assumptions about them. But using the Enneagram just as a tool for self-observation
Mhm.
still applies these same principles, right? So, for example, again, I'm an Enneagram type 8, and like I said, I've got some of the baggage that comes along with that, and I like to joke that I'm kind of like whiskey, right? I can be an acquired taste, right? And not everybody loves me, but once you get a feel for it, I'm not so bad. But usually when people get frustrated with me, my immediate response is to think it's their fault. Okay, that it's some problem with them. And then they'll say to me, well, you tend to be bossy, or you tend to be this, you tend to be that. And my first reaction is to deny it and say, no, it wasn't me, it was you. And my wife will do this. She'll say, there's this book you should read. Okay. And in fact, you should read
Did you
this
write it?
chapter. And by the way, you wrote that book, if you remember, and it's like, oh yeah, shit, I do that. Right. So again, it's this reminder that, I tend to fool myself and think things are other people's fault. So using it on yourself is a great place to focus, Ernie. Thank you. All right.
Mario, it has been requested that we stop the recording so people are more comfortable with sharing.
Okay, sure.
I'm okay with doing that.